March 24th, 1945. 1,420 hours. 25,000 feet above Berlin, Germany. Captain Roscoe Brown spotted them first. 3 silver shapes moving impossibly fast to the cloud layer below his P-51 Mustang. B-262 jets, the Luftwaffe's secret weapon, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Brown's Mustang could barely break 400. In a straight chase, the German jets would leave him behind like he was standing still. But Brown wasn't planning to chase. He was escorting B-17 bombers deep into Germany, and those jets were heading straight for his bombers. Brown pushed his Mustang's throttle forward, rolling into a dive that would either intercept the lead jet or send him screaming past at a closing speed that would tear his aircraft apart. Behind him, painted on the tail of his fighter in distinctive red paint, was a symbol that German pilots had learned to fear and Allied bomber crews had learned to love: the red-tailed 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red-Tail Angels. They were the best escort pilots in the entire 8th Air Force, with a reputation for never abandoning the bombers they were assigned to protect. White bomber crews who'd initially refused to fly with black escorts now specifically requested them. "Give us the red tails," they'd say. "Those guys bring everyone home." But what made this moment extraordinary wasn't just that Brown was about to shoot down one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world while flying a plane that was 100 miles per hour slower. What made it extraordinary was that 2 years earlier, the United States Army Air Corps had officially stated that African Americans lacked the intelligence, coordination, and courage necessary to fly military aircraft. Brown and the other Tuskegee Airmen had proved them wrong in the most definitive way possible, by becoming the most requested fighter escort in the European theater, by destroying 112 German aircraft in air combat, by flying more than 15,000 combat sorties, without losing a single bomber to enemy fighters on missions they escorted, and by bringing their bombers home when other fighter groups were too busy chasing glory to remember their mission. This is the story of how they did it. In 1940, the United States was not at war, but war was coming. Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe. Japan was expanding aggressively across Asia, and the United States Army Air Corps was rapidly expanding, training thousands of pilots to fly the fighters and bombers that would be needed if America entered the war. But there was a problem, or rather, there was a policy. The Army Air Corps, like the rest of the U.S. military, was racially segregated. African Americans could serve in the military, but only in segregated units, usually in support roles like cooks, drivers, or laborers. They were not allowed to serve in combat roles, and they were absolutely not allowed to fly military aircraft. The official reasoning was laid out in a 1925 Army War College study that concluded African Americans were unsuitable for military aviation because they allegedly lacked the intelligence, discipline, coordination, and courage required to operate complex machinery under combat conditions. The study was pseudo-scientific racism dressed up in official language, but it became official policy that would exclude black Americans from military aviation for the next 15 years. But by 1940, that policy was facing increasing pressure. Civil rights organizations, black newspapers, and progressive politicians were demanding that African Americans be given the opportunity to serve their country in all capacities, including as pilots. The political pressure was building, and the Roosevelt administration needed to respond. Enter Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, who was far more progressive on racial issues than most of her contemporaries. In March 1941, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically black college that was proposing to establish a civilian pilot training program for African Americans. The visit was supposed to be a photo opportunity, a way for the administration to show it was considering the issue. But Eleanor Roosevelt did something unexpected. She asked to fly with Chief Charles Alfred Anderson, the chief flight instructor at Tuskegee, who was one of the first African Americans to earn a pilot's license. Anderson took her up in a small 2-seater plane, and they flew over the Alabama countryside for about an hour. When they landed, Roosevelt told reporters, "Well, you can fly all right." That flight changed everything. The photo of Eleanor Roosevelt with Chief Anderson next to his airplane was published in black newspapers across the country and put enormous political pressure on the War Department to allow African Americans into military aviation. The administration couldn't publicly oppose a program that the First Lady had just endorsed by literally flying in an airplane with a black pilot. In July 1941, the Army Air Corps announced the formation of the 99 Pursuit Squadron, the first military aviation unit composed of African American pilots. The unit would train at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, using the infrastructure and instructors from Tuskegee Institute's civilian program. It was a grudging concession to political pressure, and many in the military hierarchy hoped, and some openly stated, that the program would fail, proving that the 1925 study had been correct all along. The Tuskegee program faced obstacles that white aviation cadets never had considered. Tuskegee Army Airfield was built in rural Alabama, deep in Jim Crow territory, where racial segregation was not just legal but violently enforced. Black cadets training at Tuskegee couldn't eat in local restaurants, couldn't stay in local hotels, couldn't even use public facilities in the town of Tuskegee. They faced constant harassment and threats from local white residents who resented the presence of black men training to be military officers. On the base itself, conditions were better but far from equal. Black cadets were trained by both black and white instructors, but they lived in separate barracks from white personnel, ate in separate mess halls, and used separate recreational facilities. They were training to fight for a country that refused to treat them as equal citizens, and the training standards were deliberately set higher for black cadets than for white cadets. The stated reason was that the Tuskegee program was experimental and needed to prove itself, but the real reason was that many in the military hoped the program would fail. Black cadets had to score higher on tests, perform better in flight training, and demonstrate more discipline and military bearing than their white counterparts, just to be considered adequate. The first class of cadets at Tuskegee entered training in July 1941. The class leader was Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who would become the commanding officer of the 99th Fighter Squadron. Davis was the son of Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., the first African-American general in the U.S. Army, and he had endured 4 years at West Point where white cadets had subjected him to silent treatment, refusing to speak to him except when required by military duty, refusing to room with him, refusing to socialize with him. Davis had graduated 35th in his class of 276 despite the systematic ostracism, demonstrating the kind of resilience and determination that would characterize the Tuskegee Airmen throughout the war. The training program at Tuskegee was comprehensive and brutal. Cadets learned military discipline, physical fitness, mathematics, physics, navigation, meteorology, aircraft mechanics, and finally, flying. The washout rate was high. Approximately 60% of cadets who entered the program failed to complete it, either because they couldn't meet the academic standards, couldn't master flying, or couldn't endure the psychological pressure of training under constant scrutiny and skepticism. But those who graduated were extraordinary pilots. On March 7, 1942, the first class of 5 cadets graduated from advanced flight training and received their pilot's wings and commissions as officers. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. led the class. The other 4 graduates were Second Lieutenants Mac Ross, George Roberts, Lemuel Custis, and Charles Debo. They were the first African-American military pilots in United States history. Over the next 3 years, approximately 450 pilots would graduate from the Tuskegee program, along with hundreds of navigators, bombardiers, and ground crew personnel. The program produced not just pilots, but mechanics, armorers, intelligence officers, weather forecasters, flight surgeons, all the personnel needed to operate a fighter squadron in combat. And all of them were African Americans training and serving in a segregated military that many white officers believed would fail. The 99th Fighter Squadron spent nearly a year training in the United States before being deployed overseas. During that time, the squadron faced constant questioning about its combat readiness. White officers inspected the unit repeatedly, looking for reasons to declare it unfit for combat. When inspections found the 99th to be well-trained and disciplined, some officers argued that black pilots might perform adequately in training, but would fall apart under the stress of actual combat. In April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron was finally deployed to North Africa, where American and British forces were fighting German and Italian forces for control of North Africa and preparing to invade Sicily. The squadron was equipped with P-50 Warhawk fighters, not the newest or best American fighter, but a proven aircraft that had seen extensive combat in China, North Africa, and the Pacific. The 99th's arrival in North Africa was met with skepticism and outright hostility from some white units. White pilots questioned whether black pilots would be able to perform under fire. White ground crews resented having to work alongside black personnel. And most significantly, white bomber crews initially refused to accept escort from black fighter pilots, claiming they didn't trust them to protect their aircraft. The 99th Fighter Squadron flew its first combat mission on June 2, 1943, a strafing attack on the German-held island of Pantelleria in the Mediterranean. The mission was uneventful, no enemy aircraft encountered, no losses, but it marked the beginning of the Tuskegee Airmen's combat record. Over the next several weeks, the 99 flew coastal patrol missions, ground attack missions, and bomber escorts over Sicily. The missions were relatively routine, and the squadron had not yet encountered enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. Some critics claimed this proved that black pilots were being given easy assignments because commanders didn't trust them in real combat. Then, on July 2, 1943, everything changed. A flight of P-40s from the 99th Fighter Squadron, led by Captain Charles Hall, was escorting Allied bombers attacking targets near Castelvetrano, Sicily. German FW-190 fighters, fast, heavily armed, and flown by experienced Luftwaffe pilots, attacked the formation. In the dogfight that followed, Captain Hall maneuvered onto the tail of an FW-190 and fired a burst that sent the German fighter spinning into the ground. It was the 99 Fighter Squadron's first aerial victory, and was achieved by a 23-year-old pilot from Brazil, Indiana, who had overcome poverty and racism to become a Tuskegee Airman. Hall's kill was confirmed by bomber crews and ground observers, and news of a victory was published in black newspapers across the United States. But the skepticism didn't end. In fact, it intensified. After several months of combat operations in Sicily and Italy, white officers filed reports claiming that the 99 Fighter Squadron was underperforming compared to white squadrons. The reports were vague and primarily based on subjective impressions rather than objective data, but they triggered an official investigation by the Army Air Force's Inspector General. The investigation examined the 99th's combat record in detail. Missions flown, enemy aircraft encountered, victories achieved, losses suffered. The findings were clear. The 99 Fighter Squadron had performed equal to or better than white fighter squadrons operating in the same theater under the same conditions. The claims of underperformance were unsupported by evidence and appear to be based on racial prejudice rather than objective assessment. The investigation's findings vindicated the Tuskegee Airmen, but more importantly, they destroyed the argument that black pilots couldn't perform in combat. The 99th had faced the Luftwaffe in air-to-air combat and had proven they could fight and win. They had conducted ground attack missions against heavily defended targets and had accomplished their objectives. They had escorted bombers through enemy airspace and had brought them home safely. The success of the 99th Fighter Squadron led to the expansion of the Tuskegee program. In 1943, the Army Air Forces authorized the formation of the 332nd Fighter Group, which would consist of 4 squadrons, the 99th, which would be transferred from its initial assignment to join the new group, plus 3 newly formed squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had been promoted from captain, would command the group. The 332nd Fighter Group deployed to Italy in early 1944, based at Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast. From there, they would fly escort missions for American bombers attacking targets in Germany, Austria, and occupied Europe. And it was in Italy that the Tuskegee Airmen would earn their legendary reputation and their immortal nickname, the Red Tail Angels. When the 332nd Fighter Group arrived in Italy in January 1944, they faced the same skepticism that had greeted the 99 Fighter Squadron in North Africa. White bomber crews didn't want black escorts. White fighter pilots didn't want to fly alongside black squadrons. Ground crews resented the integration of black and white personnel working on the same aircraft. But Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. had a plan to overcome that skepticism, and it had nothing to do with speeches or appeals of fairness. Davis knew that the Tuskegee Airmen would be judged solely on their combat performance, and he intended to make that performance so outstanding that it couldn't be denied or dismissed. The plan had 2 components. First, the 332nd would adopt a distinctive marking that would make them instantly recognizable. All of the group's fighters would have their tails painted bright red. The red tails would serve as both identification and intimidation. German pilots would know they were facing the 332nd, and American bomber crews would know their escorts had arrived. Second, and more importantly, Davis issued orders that would define the Tuskegee Airmen's approach to bomber escort and ultimately create their legendary reputation. The orders were simple. Stick with the bombers. Do not leave the bombers to chase enemy fighters. Do not abandon the formation to pursue personal glory. The mission is to bring the bombers home, not to rack up kills. This was a revolutionary approach to fighter escort, and it went against the standard practice of most American fighter groups. The typical escort tactics in 1944 involved fighters flying above and ahead of bomber formations, and when enemy fighters appeared, the American fighters would leave the bombers to engage the enemy aircraft. The idea was that by chasing away or shooting down enemy fighters, the escorts were protecting the bombers. In practice, this often meant that bomber formations were left unprotected, while their escorts chased German fighters across the sky. German pilots learned to use decoy aircraft to draw away American escorts, then attack the now vulnerable bomber formations with their main force. Bomber losses were heavy throughout 1943 and early 1944, and bomber crews complained that their fighter escorts were more interested in accumulating kills than in actually protecting the bombers. The 332nd Fighter Group did it differently. When German fighters appeared, the Red Tails didn't chase them. They stayed with the bombers, positioning themselves to intercept any German aircraft that tried to attack the formation. If German fighters came close, the Red Tails engaged them, but only long enough to drive them away, not to pursue them far from the bomber formation. This tactic had several effects. First, it actually protected the bombers more effectively than the standard escort tactics. German pilots found it much harder to attack bomber formations escorted by the Red Tails because the escorts were always there, always between the German fighters and the American bombers. Second, it infuriated some white fighter pilots and commanders who believed that the Tuskegee Airmen were not aggressive enough and too timid to chase the enemy. The criticism was absurd. The 332nd was engaging German fighters in combat regularly and achieving kills, but it reflected the persistent belief among some white officers that black pilots lacked the aggressiveness and courage for air combat. Third, and most importantly, it made the 332nd Fighter Group extraordinarily popular with bomber crews. White bomber crews who had initially refused to fly with black escorts began specifically requesting the Red Tails. "Give us the Red Tail Angels," they would say. "Those guys bring everyone home." The nickname Red Tail Angels spread throughout the bomber groups operating from Italy. Bomber crews would look for the distinctive red tails when their escorts arrived and would breathe easier when they saw them. There was a widespread belief, which would eventually become part of the Tuskegee Airmen legend, that the 332nd never lost a bomber to enemy fighters on missions they escorted. The reality was more complicated. Historical research after the war found that the 332nd Fighter Group did lose some bombers to enemy action, approximately 25 bombers over the entire war, out of thousands of escort missions flown. But compared to other fighter groups, the 332ND's loss rate was significantly lower. And more importantly, bomber crews perceived the Red Tails as the safest escorts, and that perception was based on actual experience. When the Red Tails were escorting, bombers were much more likely to make it home. The missions the 332nd flew were among the most dangerous of the war. Strategic bombing of Germany in 1944 and 1945 meant flying hundreds of miles deep into enemy territory, through heavy anti-aircraft fire against an enemy that was desperate and still very dangerous. The Luftwaffe might have been outnumbered by 1944, but German pilots were experienced. Their aircraft were good, and they were defending their homeland with desperation born of knowing they were losing the war. The 332ND's typical mission profile went something like this. Pre-dawn briefing at Ramitelli Airfield, where pilots learned the target for the day, a factory in southern Germany, an oil refinery in Austria, a rail yard in occupied Yugoslavia. Weather forecast, always critical for flying at high altitude over mountains. Intelligence briefing on expected enemy opposition. Maintenance status of aircraft. Takeoff would be early morning, with the group climbing to altitude and rendezvousing with the bomber formation they would escort. Once joined with the bombers, the fighters would weave back and forth above the formation, flying in an S pattern to stay with the slower bombers without stalling their faster fighters. The flight into enemy territory would take hours, with pilots constantly scanning the sky for enemy aircraft. German fighters would typically attack during the bombing run, when the bomber formation was most vulnerable, flying straight and level through anti-aircraft fire while bombardiers aimed their payloads. When German fighters appeared, the Red Tails would position themselves between the enemy and the bombers. If Germans pressed an attack, the Tuskegee Airmen would engage short, violent dogfights at 25,000 feet, where a moment's inattention meant death. The goal wasn't to chase every German fighter to the ground. It was to break up their attacks, force them to disengage, make them choose between fighting the escorts or attacking the bombers. After the bombing run, the long flight home, still in enemy airspace, still vulnerable to attack, with ammunition running low and fuel gauges dropping. German fighters would sometimes attack on a return flight, try and pick off stragglers or damage vulnerable bombers. The Red Tails would shepherd the formation home, staying with any bomber that was damaged and limping back to friendly territory. Landing back at Ramitelli meant maintenance crews swarming over the aircraft, checking for damage, repairing bullet holes, refueling, rearming. Pilots would debrief with intelligence officers. Enemy aircraft encountered, combat actions, damage to friendly aircraft, status of bombers escorted, then maybe a few hours of rest before the next mission. The 332nd flew these missions day after day, week after week, month after month. Between January 1944 and the end of the war in May 1945, the group would fly more than 15,000 individual combat sorties, takeoffs and landings by individual aircraft on combat missions. They would escort hundreds of bomber formations deep into Germany. They would engage German fighters in air combat hundreds of times. And they would build a reputation as the most reliable, most professional, most trusted fighter escorts in the theater. The pilots of the 332nd came from all over the United States. Captain Lee Rayford from Florida, Lieutenant Clarence Lucky Lester from Chicago, Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson from Detroit, Lieutenant Harold Brown from Minnesota, Lieutenant Walter Palmer from New York. They were college students, mechanics, teachers, farmers' sons, men who had grown up in a segregated America that told them they weren't good enough, smart enough, brave enough to fly. And now they were flying P-51 Mustangs, the best American fighter of the war, deep into Germany, protecting American bombers, fighting the Luftwaffe, and proving every day that excellence has no color. On June 9, 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group flew an escort mission to Munich, Germany. During the mission, they encountered heavy resistance from German fighters. In the dogfight that followed, the Red Tails shot down 5 German aircraft without losing a single American fighter or bomber. It was one of the most successful air combat engagements of the war for any American fighter group. On July 18th, 1944, the 332nd escorted bombers attacking targets in southern Germany. German fighters attacked in force. FW-190s and BF-109s try break through to the bombers. The Red Tails intercepted them, and in the resulting air battle, shot down 12 German aircraft. Again, no American bombers were lost. Captain Joseph Ellsbury shot down 3 German fighters in that single mission, becoming an ace 5 or more confirmed kills in one day. On August 24, 1944, the 332nd flew an escort mission to Czechoslovakia, one of the deepest penetrations into enemy territory that American bombers had attempted. The mission profile required the fighters to fly to the limit of their range, with no margin for error or extended combat. German fighters attacked, and the Red Tails engaged them while still maintaining position with the bombers. The mission was successful. The bombers hit their targets and returned safely, and the 332nd shot down several German fighters without losing any of their own. But the missions weren't always successful, and the cost was high. Fighter pilots were shot down by German fighters or by anti-aircraft fire. Some were killed instantly. Others bailed out over enemy territory and became prisoners of war. Some managed to evade capture and make their way back to Allied lines with help from resistance fighters. Each loss was mourned by the squadron, but there was no time to grieve. The next mission was already being planned. Lieutenant Robert Doise was shot down over Germany in February 1944 and spent the rest of the war as a POW. Captain Armour McDaniel was killed in action over Germany in March 1944. Lieutenant Samuel Bruce was shot down and killed over Austria in June 1944. Lieutenant Clarence Allen died when his aircraft crashed on takeoff in October 1944. The list of casualties grew throughout 1944 and into 1945, a reminder that no amount of skill or courage could guarantee survival in air combat. But the 332nd Fighter Group continued to fly and fight mission after mission, earning the trust of bomber crews and respect, however grudging, of white fighter units. The Red Tails were no longer an experimental unit that had to prove themselves. They were an elite fighter group with a combat record that spoke for itself. And then in March 1945, they encountered the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, the Me-262 jet. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was a game changer, the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, armed with 4 30mm cannons that could tear apart a bomber with a single burst. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied fighter by more than 100 miles per hour, could climb faster, and could attack from angles that propeller-driven fighters couldn't match. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was desperate. Germany was losing the war on all fronts. Allied armies were closing in from east and west. Allied bombers were destroying German cities and factories faster than they could be rebuilt. The Me-262 was supposed to turn the tide, or at least slow the devastating bombing campaign that was crippling Germany's war effort. But the Me-262 had problems. It was mechanically unreliable. The jet engines would fail catastrophically if pushed too hard or operated improperly. It was difficult to fly. Pilots transitioning from propeller aircraft to jets needed extensive training to avoid fatal mistakes. And critically, the Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when its speed advantage disappeared and it became a slow, easy target. Allied fighter pilots learned to patrol German airfields where Me-262s were based, waiting to attack the jets when they were most vulnerable. But in the air at altitude, the Me-262 was nearly untouchable. Catching a jet in a propeller-driven fighter required exceptional skill, perfect positioning, and a lot of luck. On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group was escorting B-17 bombers on a mission to Berlin, the German capital, heavily defended, deep in enemy territory. It was one of the most dangerous missions an American bomber crew could fly, and the Tuskegee Airmen were providing the escort. Captain Roscoe Brown was flying his P-51 Mustang at 25,000 feet, weaving back and forth above the bomber formation, when he spotted three silver shapes moving fast below him, Me-262 jets, climbing to attack the bombers. Brown knew that if the jets reached the bombers, they would cause terrible damage. The jet's 30mm cannons could destroy a B-17 with just a few hits, and the jet speed meant it could attack, disengage, and attack again before slower propeller fighters could intercept. Brown didn't hesitate. He rolled his Mustang into a steep dive, pushing the throttle forward to build speed. He was diving from above and behind the jets, trying to intercept them before they reached the bombers. The mathematics of the intercept were brutal. Brown's Mustang could dive at about 450 miles per hour, while the jets were climbing at close to 500 miles per hour. If Brown didn't position the dive perfectly, he would either overshoot the jets or miss them entirely. Brown lined up on the lead jet and opened fire. His 6.50 caliber machine guns sent a stream of tracer rounds toward the silver shape ahead of him. The jet pilot saw the tracers and broke left, trying to evade. Brown followed, pulling his Mustang through a turn that pushed him back into his seat with forces approaching the limits of human endurance. The jet was faster, but Brown had positioned himself perfectly. The German pilot couldn't escape without abandoning his attack on the bombers. Brown fired again. This time his round connected. The jet's right engine erupted in flames and black smoke. The Me-262 rolled inverted and fell out of the sky, trailing fire. Brown pulled out his dive and climbed back to bomber formation, scanning for more threats. He had just shot down one of only 7 Me-262 jets destroyed by American pilots flying prop-driven fighters in air-to-air combat. It was an extraordinary feat of marksmanship and flying skill, and was accomplished by a Tuskegee Airman in a bright red-tail P-51 Mustang. On the same mission, two other red-tail pilots, Lieutenant Earl Lane and Lieutenant Wenzel Bill Wingate, also engaged Me-262s. The jets were fast, but the Tuskegee Airmen were skilled and they were protecting their bombers. Both pilots damaged Me-262s and forced them to break off their attacks. The bombers completed their mission and returned home safely. News of the encounters with Me-262 jets spread throughout the bomber groups. The Red-Tail Angels had faced the Luftwaffe's most advanced fighters and had driven them off. Bomber crews that flew that mission returned with stories of watching the Red-Tail Mustangs diving on the silver jets, engaging them in combat, protecting the formation. The legend of the Tuskegee Airmen grew. By March 1945, the war in Europe was in its final phase. Allied armies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into Germany from the west. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. German resistance was collapsing, but the fighting was still brutal. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything it had left into defense of Germany. Experienced pilots in jets and advanced propeller fighters, desperate attacks on bomber formations, kamikaze-style ramming attacks by German pilots who knew they were going to die anyway. The 332nd Fighter Group continued to fly escort missions through April 1945. On April 1st, they escorted bombers to Linz, Austria. On April 16th, they flew a mission to Czechoslovakia. On April 26th, their last major combat mission, they escorted bombers attacking targets in southern Germany. Throughout April, the Red Tails continued to engage German fighters, protect their bombers, and bring everyone home. On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Tuskegee Airmen had flown their last combat mission. The final tally was extraordinary. The 332nd Fighter Group had flown more than 15,000 combat sorties over 18 months of operations. They had destroyed 112 German aircraft in air-to-air combat, including 3 of the nearly untouchable Me-262 jets. They had destroyed approximately 150 German aircraft on the ground, damaged or destroyed 950 rail cars, trucks, and military vehicles, destroyed more than 40 locomotives, and attacked shipping and port facilities throughout the Mediterranean and Adriatic. 96 pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the military's decoration for heroism in aerial combat. 14 pilots received the Bronze Star. 744 pilots received air medals for meritorious achievement in aerial flight. 8 pilots received Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. had led the group through the entire campaign, flying combat missions himself, while also managing the administrative and political challenges of commanding a black unit in a segregated military. He would leave Italy with a reputation as one of the finest combat commanders in the Army Air Forces. But the Tuskegee Airmen's most important achievement wasn't measured in aircraft destroyed or missions flown. Their most important achievement was proving, definitively, undeniably, in the most high-stakes environment imaginable, that the color of man's skin had nothing to do with his ability to fly, to fight, and to lead. They had faced skepticism, hostility, and racism. They had been told they lacked the intelligence and courage for combat aviation. They had been given inferior equipment, assigned to segregated bases, and subjected to treatment that would have broken lesser men, and they had responded by becoming the best. Not good enough to satisfy their critics. The best. The most trusted escorts. The most professional fighter group. The men that bomber crews specifically requested because they knew the Red Tail Angels would bring them home. Now the war was over, and the Tuskegee Airmen were returning to an America that was still segregated, that still told black Americans they were second-class citizens, that still enforced Jim Crow laws in the South and practiced discrimination in the North. But something had changed. The Tuskegee Airmen had proved that excellence has no color, and that proof would help change America. May 1945. The war in Europe was over, and the Tuskegee Airmen were coming home. They had flown thousands of combat missions, destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft, protected American bombers over the most heavily defended targets in Europe, and earned a combat record that rivaled any fighter group in the war. They returned to an America that was largely unchanged from the one they had left. In the South, Jim Crow laws still enforced strict racial segregation. Black Americans couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white Americans, couldn't drink from the same water fountains, couldn't sit in the same sections of buses or trains. In many southern states, black Americans were effectively barred from voting through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. In the North, segregation was less formal but still pervasive. Black Americans faced discrimination in housing, employment, and education. They were denied service at businesses, excluded from labor unions, and subjected to violence by police and white civilians with little recourse to justice. The Tuskegee Airmen, combat veterans who had flown fighter aircraft over Germany, who had shot down enemy jets, who had been decorated for valor, came home to this. They couldn't rent apartments in white neighborhoods. They couldn't eat in restaurants near the bases where they were stationed. They couldn't send their children to the same schools as white children. The disconnect was stunning and infuriating. These men had fought for democracy and freedom in Europe, had risked their lives defending American values, and were returning to an America that denied them basic civil rights. In April 1945, even before the war ended, this contradiction led to a direct confrontation. At Freeman Field, Indiana, where black officers from the 477 Bombardment Group, a separate Tuskegee train unit, were stationed, white base commanders attempted to enforce segregation by designating separate officers' clubs for black and white officers. Under military regulations, all officers were supposed to have access to the same facilities regardless of race. The attempted segregation was illegal under military law. On April 5, 1945, a group of black officers attempted to enter the whites-only officers' club to challenge the illegal segregation. They were physically blocked from entering and ordered to leave. When they refused, they were arrested. Over the next several days, more black officers attempted to enter the club, and more were arrested. Eventually, 162 black officers were arrested for refusing to accept illegal segregation. The Freeman Field Mutiny, as it became known, was a direct challenge to military segregation. The arrested officers faced possible court-martial, which could have ended their military careers and left them with criminal records. But the incident drew national attention, and the Army Air Force's leadership realized they had a problem. They had arrested more than 160 combat-experienced officers for refusing to accept segregation that was actually illegal under military regulations. Eventually, 101 of the 162 officers were released without charges. The remaining 61 faced court-martial, but the charges were minor, refusing direct orders rather than the more serious charges that had initially been threatened. 3 officers were convicted and fined, but the convictions were later overturned. The Freeman Field Mutiny didn't end segregation in the military, but it demonstrated that black service members were no longer willing to passively accept discriminatory treatment. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record made it increasingly difficult to justify segregation in the military. How could the military argue that black men lacked the ability to serve alongside white men when black pilots had just spent 18 months protecting white bomber crews over Germany? How could the military maintain that integrated units would harm combat effectiveness when the 332nd Fighter Group had one of the best combat records of any fighter group in the war? These questions were asked loudly and repeatedly by civil rights organizations, by black newspapers, and by progressive politicians. The Tuskegee Airmen themselves, particularly Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., testified before Congress about their experiences and advocated for military desegregation. The pressure built throughout 1946 and 1947. President Harry Truman, who had become president after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was personally sympathetic to civil rights issues and politically aware that black voters were an increasingly important constituency. Truman also believed, based on military reports, that segregation was inefficient and harmful to military readiness. On July 26, 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which stated, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." Executive Order 9981 didn't immediately end segregation in the military. The actual integration would take several years to implement fully, but it was a watershed moment. The United States military, one of the largest and most important institutions in American society, was officially abandoning segregation. And the Tuskegee Airmen's combat record was one of the key factors that made that policy change possible. The success of the Tuskegee experiment, and it had been an experiment, grudgingly authorized by a military that didn't believe it would work, had proved that integrated units could function effectively, that black service members could perform at the highest levels, and that racial segregation was based on prejudice rather than any real difference in ability. The Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force in September 1947, and the new Air Force became the first branch of military to fully integrate, with black and white airmen serving together in the same units, living in the same barracks, eating in the same mess halls, and flying the same aircraft. The Tuskegee Airmen had opened that door. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. continued his Air Force career in the integrated military. He commanded fighter wings in Korea during the Korean War, served in senior staff positions, and in 1954 became the first African-American general in the United States Air Force. He would eventually be promoted to Lieutenant General 3 stars and retire in 1970 after 32 years of service. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded Davis an honorary 4-star, making him a full general, the rank his leadership and accomplishments had always warranted. Other Tuskegee Airmen continued their military careers in the integrated Air Force. Captain Roscoe Brown, who had shot down the Me-262 jet, left the military after the war and became an educator, eventually serving as president of Bronx Community College. Lieutenant Charles McGee flew combat missions in Korea and Vietnam, retiring as a colonel after 30 years and 409 combat missions across 3 wars. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Archer became a successful businessman after leaving the Air Force. Captain Lemuel Custis became a judge. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson became a teacher and civil rights activist. But many Tuskegee Airmen faced difficulties readjusting to civilian life. They had been officers and pilots, positions of responsibility and respect in the military. In civilian America, they faced discrimination in employment, housing, and education. Some used a GI Bill to attend college or start businesses, but they encountered racial barriers at every step. Some struggled with PTSD, the stress of combat, and the stress of fighting racism simultaneously had taken a psychological toll that wasn't fully understood or treated at the time. The Tuskegee Airmen formed veterans organizations to stay connected and to preserve their history. They held reunions, visited schools to talk about their experiences, and worked to ensure that their story wasn't forgotten. As the decades passed and the veterans aged, they became increasingly recognized as pioneers who had helped break down racial barriers in America. In 1995, the Tuskegee Airmen were inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, Congress's highest civilian honor, collectively to the Tuskegee Airmen. More than 300 surviving Tuskegee Airmen, many in their 80s and 90s, attended the ceremony at the U.S. Capitol. President Bush said in his remarks, "The Tuskegee Airmen helped win a war, and you helped change our nation for the better. Yours is the story of the human spirit, and it ends like all great stories do, with wisdom and lessons and hope for tomorrow." In 2012, Hollywood producer and director George Lucas, himself a pilot and aviation enthusiast, released Red Tails, a feature film dramatizing the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. The film received mixed reviews. Critics felt it was too conventional and didn't fully address the complexity of the Tuskegee story, but it brought the story to a new generation of audiences who might not have known about the Red Tail Angels. The last surviving Tuskegee Airmen pilots passed away in the 2020s. Brigadier General Charles McGee died in January 2022 at age 102, having flown combat missions in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. 409 combat missions over 3 wars, one of the most extensive combat records of any American military pilot. His death marked the end of an era. But the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen lives on. Their story is taught in schools across America. Their aircraft are preserved in museums, including the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Veterans groups and civil rights organizations continue to honor their memory, and every African-American pilot in the United States military, and many white pilots as well, knows that they fly in the shadow of the Red Tail Angels. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that segregation was a lie. They proved that excellence has no color. They proved that given equal training, equal equipment, and equal opportunity, Black Americans could perform at the highest levels in the most demanding circumstances. They didn't just win a war, though they did that, flying thousands of combat missions and protecting American bombers over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. They didn't just destroy enemy aircraft, though they did that too, shooting down 112 German planes and damaging hundreds more. What the Tuskegee Airmen did was prove that America's racist assumptions about Black Americans were wrong. They proved it in the most definitive way possible, by climbing into fighter aircraft, flying into combat, and coming home with a combat record that rivaled any unit in the United States military. They were told they lacked the intelligence to fly. They graduated from one of the most demanding flight training programs in the military and mastered aircraft that were among the most complex machines of their era. They were told they lacked the courage for combat. They flew into the teeth of the Luftwaffe over Germany and became the most trusted fighter escorts in the theater. They were told they lacked the discipline for military service. They maintained the highest standards of military bearing and professionalism under circumstances that would have broken lesser men. They were told they would fail, and they proved everyone wrong. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen is ultimately a story about the cost of racism and the triumph of human potential when given opportunity. It's about young men who refused to accept that they were inferior, who demanded the chance to serve their country, and who proved through their actions that they were every bit as good as anyone else. It's about Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who endured 4 years of silence at West Point and became a general. It's about Captain Roscoe Brown, who shot down a jet fighter while flying a propeller plane. It's about Captain Charles Hall, who scored the 99 Fighter Squadron's first aerial victory over Sicily. It's about the 450 pilots who graduated from Tuskegee and the thousands of ground crew mechanics and support personnel who made their missions possible. It's about the bomber crews who looked up and saw Red Tails and knew they were going to make it home. It's about the nickname Red Tail Angels and what it meant. That somewhere over Germany, in the most dangerous skies in the world, there were pilots who would never abandon you, who would stay with you no matter what, who would fight anything that tried to hurt you. And it's about America, slowly and painfully learning that the promise of equality and opportunity was stronger than the lies of segregation and racism. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't end racism. That fight continues today. But they dealt it a blow that it never fully recovered from. They proved that the 1925 Army War College study that said Black Americans couldn't fly was wrong. They proved that segregation wasn't about ability. It was about prejudice. And they proved that when America lives up to its ideals, when it gives all its citizens equal opportunity, the results are extraordinary. 78 years after Captain Charles Hall shot down that FW-190 over Sicily, after Captain Roscoe Brown shot down that Me-262 over Berlin, after Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. led the 332nd Fighter Group through thousands of combat missions, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen endures. It endures because it's a great story, Underdogs facing impossible odds. Young men proving themselves in the crucible of combat. A fight for respect and recognition that was as difficult as any battle with the Luftwaffe. But it endures most of all because it's a true story. Every mission, every victory, every act of courage and determination actually happened. The Tuskegee Airmen weren't characters in a story. They were real people who did extraordinary things. And when those bomber crews looked up and saw red tails, they knew they were going to make it home. That's the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. That's the story of the Red Tail Angels.